Hi, everyone. I am Dr. Krista Grenzevich, and I am here to welcome you to a joint effort between National History Day and the Dr. Scholl Foundation, Staging a Revolution, the Complex History of Turning Thoughts into Actions, our way of introducing the Revolutionary Ideals webinar series. And I am here with Dr. Morgan Greff, Executive Director of the Rhode Island Historical Society, who will introduce us to the webinar series. So thank you, Dr. Greff, and welcome.
Thank you. And thank you for having me here today. It is always an incredible honor and pleasure to be working with National History Day, and a special thanks to the Dr. Scholl Foundation for making this webinar series possible. I have the distinct honor today of kicking off this webinar series with you. I'm sorry I can't be there in person, but the reason why I think I was chosen for this honor is because of an incredible institute that we had the pleasure of running with National History Day in 2022. It began as a webinar series, and then we came together in person in Rhode Island and explored this idea of revolutionary ideals. As we all know, the 2026 anniversary is coming up, our semi-quincentennial. And it started to raise a lot of questions about that date. And in fact, the idea that this revolution did not spring forth in the 1770s. In fact, we argued the seeds of this revolution had been planted for centuries before. In fact, some might say that the founding of the colonies carried with them those seeds of revolution. And we wanted to explore that. But why in Rhode Island? Why were we the right place to do this? And here at the Rhode Island Historical Society, we spent a lot of time examining Rhode Island's role in these kinds of revolutionary thinking and that foundation of the colony that becomes the foundation of the United States. And we wanted to explore the many ways that Rhode Island took those steps, not just to understand Rhode Island better, but actually to get all of our participants thinking about how a revolution begins. When does it begin? And by looking at different pivot points, different actions, different ideas, and also the ways in which we fail to live up to ideals. So how in the missteps along that way do we learn actually more about revolutionary thought? So today, we're going to explore some of the topics in brief that you will explore in much more depth throughout this webinar series. So with that, I'd like to get started, and I'd like to bring you here with me to Providence, Rhode Island, to start gaining an appreciation of why we chose Rhode Island as the starting point, but also to get you thinking about what in your community, what in other parts of the colonies and then the states. How do we understand when ideals turn into actions and when actions turn into a revolution? I'm sharing with you some of the words of one of the founders of Rhode Island, Roger Williams. For a small colony, we had a lot of founders, 5 main founders, but dozens of others who came to Rhode Island to escape the persecution that they were experiencing in the very recently created colonies just to our north and our east, mostly Massachusetts Bay and Plymouth. And in 1643-44, we see the creation of the Providence Compact. And in that Providence Compact, it is stated, "We, whose names are hereunder, do promise to subject ourselves in active and passive obedience to all such things, such orders or agreements as shall be made for public good, only in civil things." It's that only in civil things that really stands out and should stand out to us, because this is the first time we see codified this idea that a government is not, here in the colonies, going to subject people to a religious test. The people here in Providence do not have to conform or agree in the areas of religion, setting up a separation of church and colony, a separation of church and state. In fact, Roger Williams would go even further and states, "Enforced uniformity confounds civil and religious order and denies the principles of Christianity and civility. no man shall be required to worship or maintain a worship against his will. And I will say this, well, we'll look later at the fact that the laws of Rhode Island did not necessarily give women more rights than the laws of Massachusetts or Plymouth. Here in Rhode Island and in Providence, women could worship and maintain a worship as they so chose. And Roger Williams and the Providence colonies would fight that in courts to make sure that women had the right to liberty of conscience. According to one of the most renowned intellectual historians of the 20th century, Edmund Morgan, quote, liberty of conscience meant for Williams that no man should be prevented from worshiping as his conscience directed him. It also meant that no man should be compelled to worship against his conscience or to contribute to the support of a worship his conscience disapproved. Ensuring that Rhode Island and Providence Plantation became a place in which people from any background, religion, or nationality could make their own way did not mean that their faith or lack thereof would be celebrated, nor would they be free from the scorn of deeply religious men like Williams, right? So separation of church and state doesn't mean that everyone is celebrating each other's faith. What it means is there is a deep, stated, and codified direction of toleration or tolerance that says that everyone is allowed to be there. And not only, you will note, could they do this, they could not be forced to pay for the support of another church. So it's not just that you didn't have to belong, but you would not be tithed either. So this is an important difference among the colonies in New England. But something that here in America in 2023, we often take for granted. So we have to think about these origins in the 1640s, not just in the 1770s. Another historian, William McLaughlin, writes, well, everyone respected the right of each individual to believe and worship as he so chose, or not at all. The privatization of religion led to a new emphasis on economic self-interest as the motivating force of the colony. Once Rhode Island had rebuilt their towns after King Philip's War, they turned their wits and energy toward economic survival. So McLaughlin is putting forward an argument that this lack of religious tithing led to a dedication of economic self-interest, making it an economically driven colony, but also that it meant individuals could take more of the profits that they are making and invest them more heavily in business so that one keeps growing on the other. So any merchant, any businessman could come here, no matter their creed, their ethnicity, or their faith, how they could worship however they so chose, and they could ply that trade. But there were dire consequences to that we'll explore throughout this webinar. And those dire consequences are often the exploitation and oppression of other groups of people. Most markedly, we will see this in the relationships with the indigenous population, as well as Rhode Island's role in the transatlantic slave trade and in colonial enslavement. These are all topics we'll explore as we move forward with this webinar. But a little bit more about Roger Williams. So if our students learn anything about Williams, it's often that he was banished from Massachusetts because he wasn't religious enough. And this couldn't be farther from the truth. In fact, Williams is incredibly devout, so devout that he has a tendency to really irritate and alienate the people of Massachusetts, then Salem and Plymouth, because they feel he is actually putting the status of their colonies at risk with England. Because Williams is saying that things like, we shouldn't be flying a flag of England. If we're separatists, we shouldn't, when we go back to England, be dining and going to attending these churches, these Anglican churches. If we are to separate, we must be separated in thought and in action. And so this kind of provocative rhetoric is actually what's putting him at odds with the powers that be that brought him to the colonies to be a minister, to be the teacher of these parishes. But he simply cannot, because of his conscience, play down his concerns about this lack of separation. So they keep telling him, you've got to stop preaching. He refuses to stop. He cannot be stopped. And so he moves to different areas All the while, he's also, as many people, farming, he's trading, and he's setting up trade systems with many of the indigenous peoples and populations. Now, what you'll see on the screen right now is a much later lithograph of the landing of Roger Williams in Rhode Island. As you can see, this is an incredibly fanciful image. We have no images of Roger Williams from life. We do not know what he looked like, but I can guarantee you he didn't show up like that, and that is not how he was greeted. So the reality is much more stark. He is banished for holding new and dangerous opinions, and he must leave immediately, and he leaves on foot in the winter, trekking through a terrible New England winter in the small ice age that they were in at the time. And ultimately, he ends up in this area that is now East Providence. He's there setting up with his fellow colonists some of the lands. He has been fortunate in his trade systems with the indigenous populations to have learned a lot of the language base that is spoken by the Wampanoag, the Pokanoket, and then the Narragansett, with whom he has been trading and ultimately would be living. And so he moves into this area, setting up farms, and he is informed by Plymouth that they have claimed this area and he's got to keep moving. And because of the relationships that he had developed with the indigenous populations who were living in this area from time immemorial, in this area of Providence, which is Narragansett land, and adjacent lands which were controlled by the Wampanoag and the Pokanoket and the Pecasset. And he comes here and he is welcomed and able to negotiate a settlement. Whether or not that settlement and the deeds that we have from the 17th century were understood fully by all parties is something certainly that historians are debating. But we do know that it was a settlement that was established at the head of the river in what is now Providence, Rhode Island. And so in 1636, this town is founded by this deeply religious man who, it would seem, could set up a colony to operate with his views and his faith. And instead, what he chose to do was set up a colony that embraced democracy for men and the separation of church and state. So just to give you an understanding of what some of the main indigenous nations of the region were at this time, you can see the Narragansett in the main part of Rhode Island, but also extending into the Wampanoag Nation as well. And so those lines have changed frequently. In fact, it wasn't until the era of the Civil War that some of those lines between Massachusetts and Rhode Island were finally negotiated. So there's a lot of back and forth in these created boundaries that exist. What we do know about the Narragansett is that they were an exceptionally large and powerful nation. The historians are still debate what disease ravaged the nations more in the Massachusetts area that was brought probably by traders over the years. So European merchants who were coming in, fishermen and who are coming ashore, bring with them disease. And this ravages the indigenous populations. We don't know to what extent those numbers are brought down, but what we do know is it diminishes their access and their power greatly. The Narragansett seem to have been spared from much of that and retain a lot of their power in this period. So, so every nation, every people is in a different situation relative to the colonists as well as to the diseases that had been brought. And Williams is very concerned with his relationship with the indigenous peoples for a number of reasons. One of which is he's always been interested in languages. We know that he was self-taught in Dutch as a child. He worked in the Star Chamber as a young man. He created his own form of shorthand. He was a brilliant man and very good with languages. And as soon as he got to the colonies, he began chronicling the practices and the languages of the Algonquin-speaking people. And he produced, it was published in England, A Key into the Language of America. And the reason why, of course, the powers that be in England like this is this would help with trade. It would help with the colonists setting up and moving into the hinterlands. It would help them spread the faith in Christianity. So Williams recognized that this would be something that would appease the English powers that are giving him the right to be in these colonies. So while he may be doing it to build these relationships, and he deeply believes that you should be able to speak this language, it also has these other ancillary relationships to colonization. One thing I should also mention is something that put him at odds in Massachusetts as well is his very outspoken belief that you should be buying lands for the purposes of colonization from the indigenous population. So you should not be just seizing lands. This was not the wilderness. You could not just take them. They belonged to someone. What I will say is there were many people in Massachusetts who were doing that kind of negotiation, but in Rhode Island, this became an expectation and was not always easy, but you can find land deeds. Again, did people understand the implications of this? That's a whole other story and something that we'll be exploring in more depth. But it is a key difference and an important part of what Williams is bringing to the table. And that is a dedication to communication. So the colonial boundaries by 1688 are on the screen right now. You can start to see at this point the development also of the English colonies, the relationship to the Dutch colonies, thinking about the overlayment there with the indigenous populations. But two things have happened in the time period since Williams has come to Rhode Island. We have the Pequot War, which is raging right as he begins settlement, and then King Philip's War. One of the bloodiest conflicts in the history of North America. It is deserving of an incredible amount of study to understand the relationship between these colonies and the indigenous populations. And it is central to Rhode Island, despite the fact that Rhode Island's government said that they would not allow Rhode Islanders to be involved. So Rhode Island would be neutral, the Narragansett state that they will be neutral, but the actions of the other colonies and allowing the other colonies to come into Rhode Island brought that war right here to the mainland of Rhode Island. And it was a hideous war that changed colonial relationships with the indigenous population from that point forward. And there is incredible scholarship that has been done on King Philip's War, and certainly something that deserves more attention within our classrooms. So one of the other interesting relationships in the colonies is with women. As I mentioned earlier, while the laws in Rhode Island did not extend, say, to property ownership for women in more than they did in Massachusetts, what they allow and support is for women to preach and for women to worship as they so chose. And so Rhode Island is a different kind of place. And one of the people who becomes a founder of Rhode Island is Anne Hutchinson. And in 1637, in Massachusetts, Hutchinson is tried in civil court for traducing, so slander, basically. Others say she was tried for heresy, and others still say she was simply tried for ignoring proper gender roles and acting as a woman in ways that were not appropriate. It's John Winthrop who brings the charges against Anne Hutchinson. So this is not in Rhode Island where this happened. She is still in Massachusetts. And Winthrop would say, quote, that Anne Hutchinson would interpret passages from the Bible at her pleasure and expound dark places of scripture and make it her own, rather than sticking to what he felt were, quote, the wholesome truths. She set forth her own stuff. So he, Winthrop, who brought the charges, served conveniently as chief prosecutor and chief judge. Women could not vote in church matters, and they could not even speak in church. They entered through separate doors. They sat separately. So this is, again, a very different type of Protestant church than we might be imagining in 2023. In the trial, the prosecutors stated, quote, that Anne Hutchinson had rather been a husband than a wife, and a preacher than a hearer, and a magistrate than a subject. So here they are setting up this argument, right? She is acting outside of her station. She is preaching to people within her own home. At first, she begins by having just women come and listen to her interpretation of the scripture. She believes that she has a personal relationship with God, and she is preaching from that point of view. Soon, those women start bringing their husbands, and that's when the church really steps in, and Winthrop steps in and says, you're not allowed to do this. But in this trial, Anne Hutchinson makes the mistake of asserting that she has received direct revelation from God and that she could interpret the scriptures for herself. And at that point, her fate was sealed. So we have to think about the role that women play in this area. A book called Albion's Seed does a really nice job with that. So in New England, marriage was often delayed 10 years beyond puberty, so fairly late. But nearly everyone eventually was married, 94% of women, 98% of men. Whereas in England, only about 27% of the population was unmarried. So in the colonies, we're really looking at 5% versus 27% unmarried back in England. Women who did not find a partner by age 30 were often called thornbacks, which is a lovely term that came from England. And in the Puritan colonies, many Puritans suspected that women who were not married, it was a sign of God's ill favor. And so there was in New England a proverb that women dying maids lead apes in hell. And so basically that you're doomed if you as a woman are not married. So Hutchinson is found guilty. She challenged the sentence's legitimacy by saying, I desire to know wherefore I am banished. And Winthrop responded, the court knows wherefore and is satisfied, saying, we owe you no explanation. You are banished. And she, along with many of her followers, come south and end up settling in Aquidneck Island, which is now Portsmouth and Newport. And so this is how we see the movement of yet another colonial group banished for their faith and their actions and for thinking differently from the Massachusetts colonies. John Cotton later would say, and who had been a supporter of hers in the beginning, and described her as meeting as a promiscuous and filthy coming together of men and women. And so again, promiscuous not in action as we think of the word, but promiscuous in thought. Think about how committed you are to the danger of ideas if someone is accused of being promiscuous in thought. And that's what Anne Hutchinson was. So the colonies, sometimes called Rogues Island, accused of anarchy, accused of all sorts of activities that were seen as the sewer of New England, is trying to get a charter. At first, when they go over and they get the patent, they get a parliamentary patent, and that's because England is in the middle of a civil war, and there's no king from whom they can get a charter. So it takes a while, and they have to wait until the end of the Cromwellian interregnum until they can go and approach Charles II to get this charter. And at this point, they send Roger Williams, not alone. He had gone to publish The Bloody Tenement of Persecution, as well as The Key into the Language. But now he's going back with a truer diplomat based from Newport, a man named Dr. John Clark. And John Clark's job was to translate Williams' philosophy, which he also shared, he was an incredible writer and thinker himself, into a legal document that would help shape the formal nature of this colony. The details of the charter were shaped by both the contours of the English Civil War and the growing influence of Clark, who stayed in England for more than a decade to secure this charter. So this was no easy feat. So you're doing this kind of diplomacy day in and day out. And basically, Charles, who is sympathetic to this idea of religious freedom, the relationship, of course, between Protestants and Catholics being deeply entwined in his family. And he allows Rhode Island, this little colony, to set forth in what they call in this charter a lively experiment. And that is a lively experiment in religious freedom and toleration. What harm could it do? But the argument here is those ideals, as rarely as they are lived up to in their full beauty, are they the beginning of a revolution? Is the idea of a government only existing for as long as it meets the needs of its people? Is that a revolutionary thought? And how do we understand in the 1660s that codification as potentially, again, one of those seeds of revolution? But this concept of liberty and freedom certainly did not extend to everyone. And while we talked about this uneasy relationship with the indigenous populations, because of course we are, as in Rhode Island, there's this colonizing force that is pushing out and disempowering and worse the indigenous populations of this area. It is Rhode Island's role in the transatlantic slave trade where we start to see this question of, with liberty for whom? With liberty only for some. There was indigenous enslavement after the Pequot War and after King Philip's War. So enslavement was not new in this soil when the transatlantic slave trade was brought to our shores. It was had been practiced in other cultures, but it is, in fact, a unique form of enslavement that takes root in North America in this period. And the transatlantic slave trade and the way that you'll be studying this and unpacking it as you move further into this webinar, again, have interesting roots in these concepts of liberty. So in 1652, Rhode Island first passes a law, which is the first law on the abolition of the trade, the slave trade. It's first law in the 13 colonies, but it's never really enforced. So the law is on the books, but that doesn't really matter. And in 1696, after England finally revokes the monopoly that's been held by the Royal African Company to control the slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade. So 1696, England does away with that monopoly, and Massachusetts and Rhode Island jump right in. And so again, to tie back to that idea of the rampant speculation that is allowed in this colony. So Massachusetts, 1696, Rhode Island, 1696 is the sea flower that comes to Rhode Island, carrying with it enslaved individuals to Rhode Island and the Newport area. So this is something that in many ways often surprises our students, sometimes our fellow teachers, that New England plays such a role in the transatlantic slave trade and has enslavement embedded within the colonial structure. We often focus, of course, on the role of the South, and we think of the North as abolitionists, but nothing could be farther from the truth in this area. And Rhode Island, in fact, controls 60% of the trade out of mainland North America. So by 1750, about 10% of the population of Rhode Island are enslaved people of African heritage. That number, percentage-wise, goes down a bit, goes up a bit here and there, depending upon the amount of population overall. So by 1774, the enslaved population in Rhode Island was 6.3%, but it was more than 13% in some of the towns and municipalities, making it higher, in fact, by the 1750s, twice as much in percentage from the other colonies in New England. So this is a major part of colonial Rhode Island's economy, not just the trade, but the work and labor of enslaved men, women, and children on our soil. By the 18th century, many colonial officials had settled basically on a system of race-based slavery. That 1652 municipal law was superseded in 1703 by a law passed by the Rhode Island General Assembly that legally recognized Black and Indigenous slavery and whites as owners. Rhode Island playing this pivotal role in the transatlantic slave trade, especially the triangular trade between New England, West Africa, and the West Indies, meant that rum-laden ships from Rhode Island sailed to Africa, acquired men, women, and children, putting them aboard ships and returning to the West Indies, to the South, where they would then participate in the sale of these individuals and then load up the ships with more raw materials to bring back to Rhode Island to create things that then would be sold as part of this process yet again. And so this is an incredible global economic cycle that Rhode Island is a key part of. A big part of that, of course, are distilleries. Newport alone boasted 24 distilleries. And so you see the role of alcohol, especially rum. In Providence, they tried gin a little bit, but rum really became the crucial piece of the economy. And we can see some of that being played out in this painting called Sea Captains Carousing in Suriname, which is Rhode Island sea captains. The painting is in Missouri, and you can see it there in person. But you can see here this painting of these sea captains in an imagined evening at the tavern. And that the reason is that our relationship with Dutch Suriname was so deep that there were times where 13, 20 leaders of the Rhode Island merchant class would find themselves in Suriname together and at the same time. And so we really want to, again, stress the global nature of this trade and the role that little Rhode Island was playing in this. So despite all of the espoused ideals, here is this industry that seems so profoundly counter to them, becoming the core of an economic structure. Over the course of the 18th century, Rhode Islanders undertook more than 1,000 slave trading voyages, bearing over 100,000 men, women, and children into New World enslavement. While this only accounted for a small fraction of the 12 million Africans transported to the Americas over 350 years of the transatlantic slave trade, this traffic was vital to Rhode Island's economic development. One would be hard-pressed to find any 18th century Rhode Islander whose life was not entangled in some fashion with the slave trade. A few made great fortunes off of enslavement. So as we talked about before, Rhode Island is controlling 60% of the slave trade from North America, so mainland North America. And Rhode Island has the highest percentage of enslaved people in New England. We also want to think about New England slavery or enslavement as slightly different than we hold in our heads for Southern enslavement. If only that the holdings, there aren't as many large plantations with hundreds of enslaved peoples. We often see smaller concentrations in different kind of family groups, but we see there's a high level of urban enslavement where different skills are being used versus the South County planters, as they are called here. And what does it look like in terms of if most of the enslaved peoples are being taken to the West Indies? What does that mean here? What does that look like? Rarely in New England do you have what you sometimes can see at historic sites in the South, where you see an auction block or a building in which auctions took place. What you see here is an advertisement, a newspaper advertisement, where you can see that just imported in the sloop Elizabeth from Africa and to be sold by John Miller at his house or store. So what we see is actually how incredibly ubiquitous all of this is. individuals, human beings, are being sold into, they're already enslaved, but they were being sold to families, to corporations, in people's front parlors, at the coffee exchange, in a dry goods store. It's happening everywhere. And so while there may not be one location that you can look for and say, this is where it happened, it's because it's happening everywhere. And so we need to understand the profusion throughout New England's landscape of where this activity is taking place. It is not concentrated on a farm. It is not concentrated in one building or in one person. It is absolutely pervasive throughout our economy and throughout our society. So it is, these systems are already in place in the 18th century. And here's an image, in fact, a family painting of those South County planters. This is a portrait of John Potter and his family, including 3 young women and a young Black servant. Now you'll see that quite frequently, that servant and slave are sometimes used interchangeably. So you have to do research to find out whether or not that word servant is being used as we use it today, meaning a free person who works in service, as an indentured servant, or as an enslaved person who's being, who's with the moniker servant is being applied. So, right, there's some unpacking we have to do when we see that word. And so South County in Rhode Island, the southern counties of the state, are where you see a much more typical farming environment. And so the people who are coming here are not just working on farms, so they are highly skilled laborers within the South County planters environment. So they are becoming stone cutters, coopers, barbers, weavers, a number of trades, diverse trades that are necessary to the 18th century economy. And they're being done by both free and enslaved people of color, as well as other types of laborers from European backgrounds, from indigenous backgrounds. So we're seeing a mix there, but we want to remember and understand enslaved individuals are highly skilled in the work of the 18th century. Urban enslavement is different in the types of jobs that they're doing. So you see more shopkeeping, masons, again, coopers, candle makers, cordwainers, sailors, caulkers. In short, any of the industry, artisanal industries that are happening, that work is being done by highly skilled people of color, whether they're free or enslaved in this period. And so we want to understand too, women who are not just domestic servants, that's of course occurring, but also as seamstresses. Some of the most highly skilled mantua makers of the period are enslaved women. So it's not that slavery was somehow, you sometimes hear people say things like, well, it was different. It was not as, it was more benign. In no way was this more benign. This is the deprivation of liberty, it's the deprivation of freedom. It is a lack of having control over one's life. There is nothing benign about this institution in New England. It simply looked a bit different and functioned a bit differently, but it was very much here. And one of the ways you're going to hear from an incredible historian named Christy Clark-Vajera during this webinar and her book, Dark Work. And you know, she is incredibly precise in looking at the different laws and the ways in which we can understand that. So 1703, Rhode Island passes a law stating that all people of color, whether enslaved or free, could not be out after 9 p.m. without their master's, employer, or other lawful purpose. If they were, any white person could take them and deliver them to the constable. So all whites were, in our terms, deputized as police. The punishment for this was up to 15 lashes on the back. The act also forbade free whites from, quote, entertaining men's servants, either Black or Indigenous, without leave of their masters or to whom they belong after 9 o'clock, or face a fine of 5 shillings. So, right? So if you are a person of color and you are caught out, you will be lashed. if you are a white person who is spending time with, having a drink with, seen socializing with an Indigenous person, a person of color, you can be fined for this. So Clark Pajero writes in her book, in other words, all whites are acting as police for all Blacks and all Native Americans. Whiteness was legally endowed with privileges and power, while people of color were legally identified as suspect and in need of supervision. In 1708, law forbid whites from socializing with Black slaves or Indian servants, as they were called. A 1714 law forbade enslaved people from traveling on ferries alone. And in 1728, the General Assembly voted to actively discourage manumission, or the freeing of an enslaved person, by the enslaver having to pay a sum of no less than 100 pounds to the town in case the freed person could not support themselves and the town had to deal with that person. So what you can see here is the way that the legal system is constructing a form of New England enslavement through regulating relationships, not just to the law, but relationships to each other. But it is true that as we emerge from the Revolution, people in New England are exploring their relationship to the concept of freedom. Now, me as a scholar, I happen to study the systems of incarceration in America. And so this is a particularly pivotal moment for the work that I do. But it's also pivotal for the work that you'll explore in this webinar with things like the Gradual Emancipation Act of 1784. And here's just a quick synopsis of what it is and what it isn't. Between 1780 and 1804, all New England states moved towards abolition. In Rhode Island, that means that a child born to an enslaved mother after March 1st, 1784, would be held in involuntary servitude until the age of 18 for women and 21 for men. Now, there are many arguments from the side of people who created this law, basically saying, well, this ensures that someone is responsible for the care of children, what should happen to these people, right? Now, people who oppose this are basically saying, so you're getting the most productive years out of this involuntary servitude, and then you're turning people loose, basically, to possibly, and as we see in the 19th century, not get the jobs that they were being hired for while they were enslaved, right? So it is an uneasy form of emancipation at best. Those born before this date continued to be enslaved for life unless they were manumitted, which many people in Rhode Island did do, a voluntary manumission at this point. But this form of involuntary servitude, this gradual emancipation, was not equality. It was not, many would argue, a real freedom of any kind. It was an assuaging of conscience. And it was still at odds with those ideals that were expressed in 1652 in that first law, and certainly at odds with they felt with the 1663 charter. It was not until 1842, with the creation of a state constitution, that slavery was legally abolished in Rhode Island. And this is true of many other states, as we'll see, about how the process that they actually used for the real end of enslavement, which is quite a different thing than the Emancipation Acts. So I also want to circle back not just to the different types of populations, but also the ways in which the word of this kind of revolution spread. And I want to talk a little bit about women and the printed word. So these are both topics we're going to explore in this webinar, the role that women play as we advance through the revolution, but also the role of the press. So this is just one quick sort of story and looking at a fascinating instance of one woman who ends up in Rhode Island. So in 1721, as a young man in Massachusetts, James Franklin began publishing a controversial newspaper called the New England Current. In his newspaper, Franklin and the other contributors or currenters voiced strong opinions about politics, religion, free speech, and even medicine, especially the controversial question of inoculation against smallpox. Such outspoken stances landed James Franklin in jail, leaving his teenage brother Benjamin at the helm of his paper. And eventually in 1727, the Massachusetts colonial government suppressed James Franklin newspaper for good. So where is a young, ambitious upstart, if you will, interested in free speech and questioning power and authority to go? Well, if you're in Massachusetts, going to Rhode Island seems like the best solution. So in 1727, Franklin moved his family and his press to Newport, where he set up the colony's first printing press. In that first year in which Franklin ran his press in the colony, he issued just 3 imprints, one of which was John Hammett's Vindication and Relation. This text illustrates the precise type of work that Franklin sought to do, but which had been silenced in Massachusetts. John Hammett's Vindication and Relation tells the story of a man who left the Baptist Church to join the Society of Friends, or Quakers. This town, this colony, was a place in which individuals committed to free speech could make a successful living printing the words of a man who lived in a place where he was free to seek his faith and speak his conscience. James Franklin didn't have very long, though, to share his work with the world. He died in 1735 on his 38th birthday, only 7 years after coming to Rhode Island. But his widow, Anne Franklin, continued to operate the press and went on to become the General Assembly of Rhode Island's first official printer, known there as the Widow Franklin. In this capacity, in 1744, she published the King Charles II Charter, making the text available throughout the colonies. Successful as a printer and a businesswoman, Franklin also assumed the responsibilities of a master craftsman, training her 2 surviving daughters as typesetters and shopkeepers. Her surviving son, James Jr., was dispatched to Philadelphia to apprentice with his uncle, Benjamin Franklin, returning to Newport in 1748 as a printer in his mother's business. In 1758, Franklin and her son launched the Newport Mercury, the first successful newspaper in Rhode Island. James Jr. served as editor and publisher, and Anne, who was ill and semi-retired, wrote some of the copy. When Franklin's surviving children died, she was once again forced to assume full responsibility for the business. In partnership with Samuel Hall, Franklin continued to publish the newspaper, making her the 4th female publisher in colonial America. The business was legally dissolved after her death in 1763, 100 years after our royal charter. And here are just some examples. This wonderful example of the acts and laws of His Majesty's colony of Rhode Island. This was her biggest commission, 1745, 500 copies of this folio edition. And then on the other side here on the right, you can see her absolutely amazing obituary. So we've now taken this journey through these founding ideals, the ways in which, with both the indigenous population and then the role of enslavement, we see ourselves not living up to those ideals, with the ways in which women are persecuted but allowed to worship, but allowed to also participate in this question of free speech, which Rhode Island is leading the charge on. And all of this is to say, are these acts of revolution? And it really is the burning of the Gaspee in 1772 that makes us ask this question again and again. And this may be an incident that you've never heard about. And I'm pretty sure there are incidents throughout the colonies along the Eastern Seaboard that don't get much attention outside of their local area, but illustrate exactly what this institute and this webinar seeks and encourages. And that is to unearth the ways in which everyday people were participating in revolutionary thought, writing, and action so that they were prepared for that moment when it was time for the full revolution that we think of, the semi-quincentennial that we are about to celebrate. In the case of the Gaspee, it's really in many ways a revenue dispute, as you will likely hear in this webinar. It was the case that ships were being seized and cargoes were being seized by the British in our ports. So ships could be stopped by the British, searched, and if you were not deemed to be paying enough excise and your taxes on those, the cargo could be seized. And Lieutenant Duddingston, who is aboard the Gaspee, is a particular thorn in the side of Rhode Island merchants who feel that he is inappropriately seizing the materials aboard their ships, in particular one large cargo owned by the Whipple family. And he's threatening them all the time, and so it happens that one of John Brown's ships is in the harbor, and Duddingston approaches them to board their ship, and they will not let him board. And this ship, the Hannah, they give chase, and the Gaspee is following them. And the Hannah, however, Captain Lindsay knows the waters better than Duddingston's crew does. And he, in fact, purposefully runs them aground on a sandbar. He then continues into Providence, and they alert the people of Providence and the merchants in Providence that this has happened, and they've got the Gaspee on the sandbar. And these men, probably in their cups, decide that they are going to row out in longboats to the Gaspee and confront Duddingston and his crew. Now, it is unclear what they planned to do when they got there, but we do know they were armed, and we do know they had a doctor with them. But in short, they fire upon the ship and they shoot Duddingston. He gets shot in the arm, goes through his arm and into his groin. They board the ship, and we don't know if it was on purpose or an accident, but we do know that the ship is lit afire and it burns to the waterline. And so these men of Providence have not, as we see in the Tea Party, thrown tea overboard. They've in fact shot an agent of Britain and destroyed a ship. They take Duddingston and the crew and they bring them ashore. And we are left to question whether or not this was the first act of the revolution. Some people say wholeheartedly that it was. And yet other scholars say, look, this was a revenue dispute. Right? This was not an act of revolution. They did not get together to start a revolution. They went there because they were mad at this guy and they wanted their cargo back and their stuff back. It was months later, while the British are looking for the men who did this, that a minister writes about this incident as a holiday sermon. And this happens in June. And in November, this sermon is then printed and circulated. And we learn a few things, right? In this sermon, they're saying this was an act of revolution. But not only that, these men are being denied the kind of trial that they are guaranteed as British citizens. It's that word that starts to spread to the other colonies, that spreads to Virginia. And it is seen as yet another incident where these men of North America are being denied their rights. And so it ends up fomenting action and thought. So does it matter that the men who committed this action did not know it was revolutionary when they did it? Are we allowed to retroactively deem something part of the revolution? And that is something that historians are still debating. So when, again, does an ideal and an action become revolutionary? In the moment or after the fact? And that's something, again, really worth exploring. Is treason revolutionary? Ever? Always? So those are the kinds of questions that these incidents, so often overlooked and not studied, can help us bring to our classrooms, can help us bring to our History Day projects as we explore those complicated questions in things like turning points. So I want to bring us back to Roger Williams as we think about whether or not the foundations of Rhode Island really have anything to do with the 1770s. And so I bring you to this quote: "But the sovereign, original, and foundation of civil power lies in the people. And if so that a people may erect and establish what forms of government seem to them most meet for their civil condition, it is evident that such governments as are by them erected and established have no more power, nor for longer time, than the civil power or people consenting and agreeing shall betrust with them." That's 1644, the bloody tenement of persecution. It sounds for all the world to me like the rhetoric of the 1770s. So where did that germ come from? And shouldn't we strive to understand these ideals, even if we've failed to perfect them? So as you listen to the scholars throughout this program, you'll repeatedly hear how people's actions don't always match their stated ideals, individual or collective. Each step, each rebellion, each article printed, or a life lived in the face of oppression, and it reinforced the ideals of tolerance, freedom, and democracy, either by showing us what expansion of these ideals looked like, or by demonstrating the profound inhumanity of their absence. By exploring the steps forward and back that peoples took to reach the American Revolution, we hope that you will see that having not lived up to the profound and foundational ideals examined here should not negate these ideals, but rather inspire us to keep working towards them, to keep practicing what in Rhode Island we call this lively experiment. So thank you so much for listening today. I hope that you're as excited as I am to go on this journey of this webinar and to learn with the extraordinary scholars that will share their time with you. Thank you so much.
That was great. I'm going to stop the recording now.